Coming out, I know it's cold out there, and now it's pretty dark, pretty early. You can all hear me without the microphone, right? Nobody's ever accused me of being quiet. So welcome to our talk, the final talk in the series that we've been conducting all semester on mindfulness, Burmese roots, and its Massachusetts branches. There's all kinds of puns involved in that for those of you who have been coming along. It's wonderful to see so many of you out here. I'm Jamie Hubbard. I teach Buddhist studies here at Smith College. And of course, I have to thank my sponsors, the Smith College Lecture Committee and the Ada Howe Kent program in non-Western religions that had funded this whole series for us. If you're interested in future things, we do quite a lot at Smith and the other 5 colleges as well. There's lots and lots of wonderful events that we sponsor all of the time. You can go to our website, in Smith College Buddhist Studies website. Please, by all means, go to our Facebook page. You can find us there too, and like us. And we post information about upcoming events there. And then, of course, we have the ubiquitous pink sign-up sheet. We maintain a mailing list that we send out. Probably many of you are on many of our mailing lists and are sick of getting blasted by numerous announcements for the same thing. But if you're not on that mailing list, please sign up and we will start to inundate you with other kinds of things. So as I said, this is the last talk in this series, but I just wanted to give a little bit of advance for the next series, next semester. It might not be so obvious when I describe this, but in my mind, it's a continuation of what we've been doing this semester. And actually, I think as Jake goes through his talk, you'll see that there are some kinds of correlations to this as well. But in any case, the next semester we're hosting another series of 5 speakers with a title somewhat like, I haven't quite figured it out yet, but it's going to be something like Buddhist Geeks, Cyborg Buddha, and New Technologies of Awareness, in which we're going to explore some of the emerging kinds of ways of doing things. The first speaker, I won't give the dates, but I'll just sort of tease you a little bit with who's coming. James Hughes, who is the director of the Cyborg Buddha Project, followed by Mike Siegel, who is president of Biofluent Technologies and the founder of the Consciousness Hacking conference series. And it was interesting, we were just talking, his last product, he's doing sort of software. There's an app for that kind of stuff. And his last product was launched at Burning Man. So that's the kind of places we're going. Followed by Robin Arnault, who's an audio designer and a game designer. Gaming is very popular. You can game your way to awareness these days. He's got a number of very interesting things he's doing. And then after that is Ariel Garten and Michael Apollo from Interaxon. They're the people some of you might know about Muse, the EEG headband that's very popular these days. She's coming out here. And then finally, in April, winding it all up, is Andrew Fenton, who does bioethics and is somewhat known or infamous perhaps for one of his articles on the ethics of pharmaceutical cognitive enhancement, Buddhism and neuroethics. So that's what we're doing next semester. But this semester, as I said, finally we have Jake Davis, who is coming to us from Brown University, where he's been for some time. He started out, he's a Massachusetts boy, then went up to Vermont and studied at Marlborough College. It was too cold up there because then he left there and went to Hawaii for an MA and returned to New York for his PhD. Jake works primarily in ethics, metaethics, normative ethics, as well as philosophy of mind and cognitive science. He does a lot with sort of empirical research and brings that together with his expertise in Buddhist philosophy, an expertise that comes not only from study but from long periods of intensive meditation. He grew up right down the street from Barrie and is very well known to all of those folks. He also has many years of training in Burma, including time as a monk in Burma, and has spent a lot of time translating between Burmese meditation masters and Western meditation masters. He's done a lot of very interesting work in a lot of different areas. One of them dealing with working with Judson Brewer from the Yale Therapeutic Neuroscience Clinic, dealing with work on the therapeutic function of mindfulness, and he's written a number of things on that. And he's also now working with Willoughby Britton and Jared, who are our last speakers. He has a number of different papers and things he's written, which I just lost all of them somewhere or another in my pile of stuff. Including, some idea maybe there's a connection with what's going on next semester. You remember, if you were here last time, we talked about the paper that he co-authored with Willoughby and Jared, Awakening is Not a Metaphor, the Effects of Buddhist Meditation Practices on Basic Wakefulness, or exploring the idea that it might be good for stress reduction, and it's in one manifestation, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to sleep well, because it actually makes you awake. It's not just a metaphor. Another one that's very interesting: can enlightenment be traced to specific neural correlates, cognition, or behavior? No, and a qualified yes. Then other articles dealing with cognitive kinds of things and therapeutic aspects of mindfulness as well. So without any more, let me welcome, let's give Jake a big hand. What is kindness about mindfulness and awareness?
Thanks so much. Sorry, I had to keep sneaking back here. They've got a screen here which makes it smooth, but it's also at an angle, so the whole computer keeps sliding down. So I wasn't trying to upstage him, but I just didn't want the whole thing to fall on the floor. So thanks so much for having me. This is really a pleasure. I'm excited about being here, and also excited about the whole series. Pretty much everybody who's spoken, Dave McMahon, Eric Braun, obviously Willoughby and Jared, are all good friends of mine, and I've been having conversations about the sorts of topics I'm going to talk about with them, some of them very recently as well, so you can get the fruits of those conversations, and hopefully we can continue it. I hope I'll keep this relatively short and allow plenty of time to have a discussion. I'd love to get a little bit of a sense of who's here. So how many people are undergraduates? Great. And how many people are faculty or researchers at academic institutions? Okay. Cool. How many of you are Buddhist scholars? And philosophers? Nada. Okay, great. And how many people how many of you would consider yourselves meditation practitioners? Interesting. Okay, great. So I'm going to talk about, the title refers in part to this second characteristic of these characteristics that are found throughout the Buddhist dialogues in the Pali Nikayas. So these characteristics are in the Pali, sanditiko, experiential I'm translating, akaliko, timeless, ehipasiko, a come and see kind of thing, opaniyiko, pachadam viditabo vinyuhi. Opaniyiko is, I'm translating progressive, but we could talk about that. And finally, this one I'll emphasize, pachadam viditabo vinyuhi, is to be experienced by the wise. The teachings are to be experienced by the wise. So that will play a role, a relatively big role in what I have to say. But the title refers to the second characteristic, that the teachings are timeless in a certain way, and I want to explore what that might mean. So I think Joseph's first book, Joseph Goldstein's, certainly one of the most successful at catching people's attention in the early days, bringing people to the Insight Meditation Society, but also getting people interested, Westerners interested in meditation practice more generally, was this book, The Experience of Insight. And I want to talk a little bit about what's so catchy about that kind of a title, about that kind of way of pitching the meditation practice as process of experiencing insight, of gaining this kind of experience. We can get a sense of it from something Joseph says elsewhere. He was meeting his teacher, Munindraji, who had practiced extensively in Burma. And this teacher said something that sealed my decision to stay in practice for as long as I could. He said, if you want to understand your mind, sit down and observe it. It was this clear, common sense, undogmatic approach that so inspired me. There was nothing to join, no rituals to observe, no beliefs to follow. the mysteries of the mind would reveal themselves simply through the power of my growing awareness. So this kind of an idea, this kind of an appeal, the appeal of a Buddhism that is without rituals, nothing to join, nothing dogmatic about it, no beliefs to follow, but just this simple experience of insight through the power of growing awareness, was very appealing to many people. It was appealing in the beginning to people like Joseph and others in this room, in fact, and in Asia, and people among them who brought it back and made it quite appealing to many people here, and in both the context of meditation centers, but also now in many secular contexts, in hospitals and schools and so on. This kind of a approach that does not emphasize ritual or dogma or beliefs to follow has been very appealing. And David McMahon, in this recent book, Buddhist Modernism, but also others, have done a good job in cataloging what the background in our own Western context was, the philosophical, cultural background that made that kind of a appeal so powerful in this context. This whole phenomenon has been termed Buddhist modernism, so I will think about it, I'll talk about it in that way too. But I want to talk about some things that folks like David McMahon and Eric Braun might not have emphasized. So I think it's important to see the appeal of this idea, the experience of insight, this direct, unmediated kind of access that we can gain without any dogma, without any beliefs or rituals to follow. I think it's important to see the appeal of this as a response to our questions, the kind of questions that we have formed in the way we are by our current historical conditions. But I also think it's really important to assess this proposal on its own merits, to get a sense of what that might look like as a proposal for a way to be, to understand all the ethical implications that are involved in that kind of a vision of how we should be. So I don't think it's possible to divorce, I'll get back to this again and again, but I don't think it's possible to divorce the kind of picture that's being presented, say, in an MBSR clinic or in mindfulness in the classroom, to divorce that from a whole picture of how human beings should be. It's part and parcel of a whole picture of how human beings should be. And it's one of a number of competing visions about how human beings should be. So I think it's important to see how that vision of how human beings should be has come to be, conditioned in the way it is. But it's also important to assess it, to see whether that's the right vision for us to hold. And it's only in that way that we can really take it seriously. So that will be what I'm up to. So here's a different vision, a little bit different, still certainly Buddhist-derived, but one very much that does emphasize a different metaphysics that's emphasized in Joseph's experience of insight. This is an image portraying, I think it's Kassapa Buddha. The basic idea that's going on here is that one ideal of a way for a human being to be is to vow to come back many, many eons later, to strive in whatever ways is necessary to come back many, many eons later to save all beings. So that's one vision of how a human being should be. Here's a different vision of how what a human being should do with a life. And here again is a different vision. That one got behind. It says, my jihad is to build bridges through friendships. So these are very different visions of how human beings should be, very different ethical visions. And I want to see this kind of a vision that we ought to sit quietly and just observe the mind as part of that conversation about how human beings should be. And this one too, this is Jon Kabat-Zinn, Coming to Our Senses. I want to think about all of these as different visions of the ethical life, different answers to the question about how we should live. And also this question, how we should know how we should live. So the ethical question of how we should live, and the meta-ethical or question in moral epistemology about how we could know how we should live. So, part one will be about the history and claims to authenticity, what history has to say about the claims to authenticity. So I want to start with this image. This is the Fisher-Price Zen Collection cradle swing. I should say that I poached this off somebody at this recent conference, AAR, American Academy of Religion, in San Diego. It was a really powerful image, and I think that it's worth reflecting on. So the idea is that there's a Zen theme to this cradle swing, and as many of you will know, the tradition of Zen in Japan has strong roots in China, as Chan, and many of the pieces of this cradle swing are also made in China. But there's something that doesn't strike us as authentically Zen about it, even so. So I want to wonder about this phenomenon of Buddhist monergism, in particular when we talk about Buddhist meditation, Vipassana meditation, coming from Burma to Bari, in packages such as this book, The Experience of Insight. To what degree is it like this? To what degree is it sort of repackaged for us, but what it's made of, and the design and what it's made of are very much of our own making? And to what degree does it have roots in the historical tradition? But I'm going to start with a foray over to Japan, partly because Bob Scharf, in an important article, talks about this context, and partly because I can then refer to this cool image of the Fisher-Price Zen Collection cradle swing. So Bob says that Asian intellectuals had to cope with the same threats to religious tradition that were being faced in the West, namely this kind of pluralism that were coming into contact with other cultures with very different visions of the ethical life, very different visions of how people should be, and also the threat to tradition that was posed by science. So Asian intellectuals were coming up against these same threats to their own religious traditions, but they also had to cope with the affront of Western cultural imperialism, sustained as it was by the West's political, technological, and military dominance. So in the face of this kind of thing, figures such as D.T. Suzuki presented Zen cultural artifacts, from koan exchanges to dry landscape gardens, as expressions of or pointers toward a pure, unmediated, and non-dual experience, known in Zen as Satori. Not only was such an experience touted as the essence of Zen, it was also said to lie at the heart of all authentic religious traditions, be they Christian, Islamic, Hindu, or whatever. However, this is about Suzuki. Suzuki's approach to Zen, with its unrelenting emphasis on an unmediated inner experience, is not derived from Buddhist sources so much as from his broad familiarity with European and American philosophical and religious writings. So for instance, this notion of pure experience, Bob Scharf says, is derived somewhat indirectly, but from William James, not from the Chan tradition. And moreover, men like Suzuki could, by appealing to these ideas, such as pure experience, that were ultimately from Western sources, they could not only affirm the experiential foundation of their own religious traditions, but they would also turn around and present these traditions as more intuitive, more mystical, more experiential, and thus purer than the discursive face of the West. In the West, in short, if the West excelled materially, the East excelled spiritually. So maybe that's part of what seems wrong with the Fisher-Price Zen Collection cradle swing, that it seems like perhaps a kind of excellence in materialism, but perhaps not a kind of excellence in spirituality. And so we can wonder whether and Bob Scharf does, whether this modern presentation of Zen is a bit like the Fisher-Price Zen Collection cradle swing, in that it has this Zen theme, but much of what goes into making that what it is was in fact produced here, synthesized here, and then recreated sort of in our image by Asian intellectuals responding to Western imperialism. A similar thing seems to have happened in Southeast Asia. So one development here was that Colonel Henry Alcott and Madame Blavatsky went to Sri Lanka and thereafter inaugurated the Buddhist Theosophical Society. This society constituted the first lay Buddhist organization that was wholly independent of the temples and monastic hierarchy. These figures trained a generation of native Buddhist leaders, providing them with the intellectual means to defend themselves in debate with Christian missionaries. So the other picture, other than those two up here, is an early debate between a Buddhist monk and Christian missionary, or Christian figure in Sri Lanka. And Bob Sharf says that we need to think of the modern Buddhist, the modern Vipassana movement, in particular the kind of movement that gained so much strength in Burma and found its way to Bari. We need to think about it in this context, in the context of Western intellectual forces and in the context of Western imperial forces. So in the context that there are philosophical ideas being brought to Asia from the West, and also that there are Christian missionaries to which Buddhist cultures need to respond. So in order to respond, they can draw on the resources of their own tradition, but they can also draw on the resources that they're getting from Western intellectuals to respond and show how their own Buddhist cultural heritage has something to say, perhaps something better to say, perhaps something more spiritual to say, in just the way that we saw in Japan, that Bob Sharf was commenting in Japan, that this allowed Asian intellectuals to portray their own tradition as less materialistic and in this way superior to the Western culture that was being imposed in their countries. Bob Sharfin, I think, rightly says we need to think of the Vipassana revival or Vipassana movement that happened in Burma in the past century in light of this, last 150 years, in light of this. The top picture is the Sixth Sanghayana, which was a collection of, it's modeled after a series of conventions that whose purpose was to collate and check the authenticity of the traditional Buddhist scriptures. And by convening one of these in Burma, the first democratic government of Burma very much was making an attempt to legitimize themselves as a Buddhist government. Another thing they did, the Mahasi Sayadaw played a major role at this convention, but another thing they did was to sponsor the creation of a meditation center, which the Mahasi Sayadaw eventually took over. And this was really the model for many meditation centers in the West. Many Westerners went there and practiced, including Joseph and others. This is Joseph showing Mahasi around in Massachusetts at IMS. And this is Bob Sharf again. Mahasi Sayadaw provided the Theravada world with more than simply an easy-to-learn meditation technique. He also provided a model of an urban meditation center that became a catalyst for the spread of meditation among the laity. Eric Braun, who spoke earlier in this series, has done a nice job of showing how this goes back even further than U Nu and Mahasi to the figure of Lady Sayadaw in Burma. Eric says in this Tricycle article, though now a global movement, insight practice had its start in an interaction between a Western empire and an Eastern dynasty. Indeed, one could go so far as to pinpoint its origins to a particular day, November 28, 1885, when the British Imperial Army conquered the Kingdom of Burma. So what Eric is suggesting is that part of the reason that Lady Sayadaw became so influential, part of what inspired Lady Sayadaw to teach, in fact, in the first place, was precisely the need to respond to these Western imperial forces, to shore up Burmese Buddhist civilization and Burmese Buddhist culture in the face of this threat from Western culture. So what Lady Sayadaw did was to appeal to the popularity of Abhidhamma, the philosophical psychological teachings in the Buddhist canon, and to encourage many, many lay people to study these texts and then to apply them to their own experience. In the course of that, he started to teach meditation practice and to start centers for lay people to practice meditation, and indeed to start a lineage that has from Lady to Seatechi to Ubakin. The student in this is Goenka, who has been extremely successful in starting many, many centers around the world, practicing a particular form of Vipassana. So there's a way to see this birth of insight, the birth of the Vipassana movement, as very much responding to a particular cultural context, that is, to a colonial situation in which there was this threat of Christian values and in British and Western values being imposed on Burmese Buddhist culture, and an attempt to respond to that, to show the value of a Buddhist way of seeing things and a Buddhist set of values in response to this foreign ethical vision. So, with this history in mind, it can look like, and this is what I want to respond to, it can look like the Vipassana movement is a lot like the Fisher-Price Zen collection, Cradle Swing, in that it's something that happened very recently. It's a set of conditions that really doesn't have much purchase much further back than Lady Sayadaw. Indeed, it is true, and I think both Bob Scharf and also Eric Braun are right to point out that there isn't much evidence beyond 2 or 3 generations before these people of who their meditation teachers were. In fact, it looks like what they did was to look at the texts, read the texts, study them, and get meditation techniques from that, apply that to their own experience. But what wasn't happening is that there was this unbroken lineage of meditation masters all the way back to the Buddha. So if our sense of why we should be practicing meditation is that it's just what the Buddha taught and has been handed down all that way in this unbroken lineage, we should question that on historical grounds. But I also think that, and this is my response, that we can ask a different question. We can ask whether we should be doing this independently of the historical question. We can ask whether it's a good thing to be doing, and what makes something a good thing for a human being to do. And that's really a philosophical question, and I'm a philosopher, so that's the question that I want to talk about. Eric and also Dave McMahon and also Bob Scharf are in many ways trained and think of themselves as historians. I'm interested in the history, but my training and really my interest is in this philosophical question: how should we be? And how could we know how we should be? So the Buddhist background is interesting to me in as much as it makes proposals, in as much as we can draw from it proposals about how we ought to be. But if it turns out that there isn't a way to appeal to this Burmese Vipassana movement as representing exactly what the Buddha taught, in the end, that's okay with me, as long as it's representing a good way for us to be. But it also may turn out that there's a historical problem with the way that this reasoning goes. So we'll get to that in a minute. In the meantime, I do want to say that Eric is actually maybe more Eric's presentation, Eric Braun's presentation, is different than Bob Scharf's in that he's also not just showing how it's very discontinuous, this Vipassana movement is very discontinuous with what went on in Burma, say 200 years before that. He's also showing aspects of continuity. And one of these aspects of continuity, as I mentioned, is that the Lady Sayadaw was very much employing these textual ideas from the Abhidhamma. I'm giving a Burmese pronunciation that actually Eric Braun was making fun of a few days ago. Anyway, from the Abhidhamma. So, for instance, the elements of earth, air, fire, and water. And the Lady Sayadaw very much emphasized this, even in teaching lay people meditation practice, that you could see in your own experience, these elements of earth, air, fire, and water. To a modern scientific mind, this may just seem like bad metaphysics, and perhaps it is, but there's a different way to take it, or there's a different way to understand what's going on. And my understanding of this is very much influenced by the fact that, as Jamie was mentioning, I've done a lot of interpretation, in particular for a teacher who passed away last June, the Chaswa Sayadaw Ulakana. And one thing that Chaswa Sayadaw, who was a disciple of Mahasi's, he taught at the Mahasi Center, and nonetheless, he very much emphasized this kind of, what I realize now must have been an influence from Lady Sayadaw. In his meditation teaching, he would absolutely emphasize that you can see in your own experience the element of heat, whether it's in heat in the body or pricking sensations in your body, that you can see the element of air in motion and movement in the breath, but also vibration in the body, that you can see the element of earth in heaviness, in the body, and that you can use these ideas of earth, air, fire, and water to track elements of experience. So there's two things going on here. One, I think, is that there's a way of legitimizing the Buddhist teachings and thereby Burmese Buddhist culture by saying, look, you can see these truths of the Abhidhamma texts in your very own experience, and therefore our teaching is more scientific than, for instance, the Christian teachings that the British imperial forces were bringing, or were being brought along with the British imperial forces. But I think there's also a different way to think about what's going on, which is that when you hold and represent in working memory an idea, such as, for instance, if I think of my foot right now, or try thinking of the back of your neck, all of a sudden you're going to start to feel more sensations at the back of your neck. And that's just a fact about the way our cognitive architecture works. If you hold in working memory a representation of a particular part of your body, that basically ups the gain on the early sensory receptors in that area, so that you start to more consciously experience more of the sensation in that area. So there's different ways to think about what's going on when the Lady Sayadaw is encouraging people to see the elements in their own experience. And I think we can think about it in this very historical, cultural kind of light, and we can also think about it from a more philosophical and scientific standpoint that looks at what's timeless in those meditation teachings and implementing those meditation practices. Timeless in the sense that it's going to work for any human given the kind of cognitive architecture that we have. Here's Eric Braun again. The majority of Theravadins and Buddhists of other traditions, including monks and nuns, have focused on cultivating moral behavior, preserving the Buddhist teachings, and acquiring the good karma that comes from generous giving. Where then did this now pervasive idea come from, that meditation lies at the heart of Buddhist life? This question brings us to Burma just over a century ago. Prior to this time, no trend towards widespread meditation had developed anywhere. So, I've been flipping back and forth, but this is the challenge I want to respond to briefly in a historical way, and then in a more extensive way from the philosophical perspective that I've gestured towards. So here's my brief historical response. The sort of things that Bob Scharf and Eric Braun and also Dave McMahon like to emphasize about what's new about the Vipassana movement in the past 150 years in Burma, I think that they are often right to say that those did not have clear precedents, say 300 or 400 or 500 years ago in Burma. However, very little of the scholarship in any of those works is about what's going on at the time of the Buddha, and in some ways we don't know historically. But I think that there's a lot of evidence from the early Buddhist texts. We can look at the Pali Nikayas, but we can also look at triangulations from the early Chinese Agamas, parallel sets of discourses that in many ways match up with these Pali Nikayas, and we can look and see what sorts of ideas, what sorts of practices are emphasized there. And I think that if you look in that way, it looks much less clear that this was a brand new thing, that if we want to look to what's happening to understand the Vipassana movement, that we need just to look to Burma 150 years ago. I think we can also look to what's going on in the thought world of whoever it was that put together the early Buddhist discourses. This is a quote from the Anguttara. It's just within this fathom-long body, with its perceptions in mind, that I make known the world, the origination of the world, and the cessation of the world, and the path of practice leading to the cessation of the world. Bhikkhu Bodhi interpreting this, and one could charge that he's just applying his Buddhist monism here, but interpreting it, he says, the world with which the Buddhist teaching is principally concerned is the world of experience, and even the objective world is of interest only to the extent that it serves as the necessary external condition for experience. I don't want to worry too much about what's going on here, but the way I'm reading this, what we're talking about is paying attention to our current experience, how it's changing, how it arises, and how it passes away. That the whole path falls under that. This is one version of the Four Noble Truths that many of you may recognize, the truth of suffering, the origin of dukkha, the origination of dukkha, the cessation of dukkha, and the path of practice leading to the cessation of dukkha. So what we're focusing on here is how inhabiting our own lived world of experience can lead to the end of suffering. There's a particular practice, of course, very much appealed to, this textual form appealed to by the Mahasi Sayadaw as well as Lady Sayadaw and others. This is the practice of Satipatthana. In regard to the body, affective reactions, states of mind, he said he was going to go. He's not actually walking up. In regard to the body, affective reactions, states of mind, perceptual experiences, one comes to rest in watching these. Anupasi vihrati, energetically atapi, clearly aware, sampajano satima, vaniya loka abhijadomanasa. In regard to the body, affective reactions, states of mind, perceptual experiences, one comes to rest in watching these, energetically, clearly aware, attentively, removing acquisitiveness and discontent. So I think that this kind of practice is very much prefigured in the early Buddhist texts. There's different ways of reading these texts, and people argue over them. Indeed, practitioners, different practice teachers argue over how these texts should be interpreted, and thus how we should practice. But what I'm going to suggest later is what they're arguing about really comes down to different ways that we should train the mind, and that comes down to different ways that we should be. It comes down to differences in ethical visions about how human beings should be. So it's not so much that the problem for me is not the question, or the question that I'm interested in asking is not so much, is this a brand new thing? I don't think it is a brand new thing, even if it's a very different thing than what was going on in Burma 300 or 400 or 500 years before. I don't think it could be all that different in the sense of increasing heightening our awareness to these kind of experiential states than what was going on when these sorts of texts were composed. What's more interesting, a more interesting question for me to ask is, take the differences between what's going on in medieval Burma, what differences between that and the modern Vipassana movement, and differences between that and these other very different visions of ethics, whether it's the jihad of Hamas or the secular jihad of, cultivating friendships. These very different ethical visions, which ones should we inhabit? Which ones should we be living? That's the question that really animates my research and that makes me interested in what's going on here. And I think it's also actually already there in the mindfulness movement. So John Kabat-Zinn commented recently that he has used the word mindfulness intentionally as an umbrella term to describe our work in the mindfulness-based stress reduction clinic, and to link it explicitly with what I've always considered to be a universal dharma that is coextensive, if not identical, with the teachings of the Buddha Dharma. By umbrella term, I mean that it's used in certain contexts as a placeholder for the entire Dharma. That is, it is meant to carry multiple meanings and traditions simultaneously, not in the service of finessing and confounding real differences, but as a potentially skillful means for bringing the streams of a live embodied Dharma understanding and clinical medicine together. So what I think is clear here is that what's being presented is not just a certain way of paying attention, but rather a whole. What Kabat-Zinn really means to be bringing across is a whole vision of how to be. So this is, I think, a competing vision with, for instance, a different way of being in which we should eat human meat. Perhaps a competing vision with the Chinese sage kings. Maybe not a competing vision with this secular vision of ethics. Perhaps a competing vision with this traditional Buddhist ethical vision. Certainly a competing vision with this vision of jihad. And I think we ought to take the vision that Joseph presents in the experience of insight, and also clinical-based mindfulness, but also programs such as mindfulness in the schools, as very much involving as very much presenting a way of being. And instead of trying to say that it's not religious, as Buddhist modernism tends to present the teachings, we should, that it's not presenting an ethical vision, we should take on board the fact that it is presenting an ethical vision and then assess whether it's a good one. Okay, so I'm going to skip that. And then in part 2, I'm going to quickly try and show you how I go about assessing this thing. And then I'll close up and we can have questions. So we started with this point that there's many different visions of how we should be. It turns out that in some texts, ones that aren't so much emphasized in the Buddhist tradition, but are very much there in the early texts, present a situation somewhat akin to this. So in the Kalama Sutta, the Kalama village people are presented with many different teachers, each presenting their own vision of how people should live and saying that everybody else's vision is rubbish. And so when the Buddha comes along as another one of these teachers, they say, how are we supposed to know who's right? Whose vision of ethics is the right one and whose is wrong? Who's lying? The Buddha's positive advice for them is that when you know for yourselves these qualities are unskillful, blameworthy, criticized by the wise, these qualities when taken on and adopted lead to harm and suffering, then you should abandon them. It's worth emphasizing that it's not just a sort of Western rationalism going on here. He is saying don't go on hearsay, don't go on tradition, don't go on faith in a teacher, but he's just as equally saying don't go only on scriptural tradition. Don't go only on reason, don't go on logical reasoning, on probability. Instead, there's something else going on, and I want to suggest that there's something experiential going on here. So what do you think, Kalamas? When lust occurs inside a person, is that for benefit or for harm? A person overwhelmed by lust, with mind taken over, kills beings, takes what isn't given, goes to others' wives, speaks falsehoods, and encourages others to do the same, which is for long-term harm and suffering. Now, it's not sufficient to say that leads to bad outcomes, because we can still question whether those outcomes are bad. It's possible to say that that killing beings, for certain ethical visions, that's the way we ought to be. But it's important that what's emphasized here is not so much the outcomes, but the qualities of heart. So I'm going to suggest that we can develop an account of which ways of beings are good ones by taking on this Buddhist proposal to focus on cetana, or attention, as the ground of ethics. So what's morally balanced on this vision of ethics about the action is the emotional motivation, for instance, love or hatred. This, I think, is a vision that's found in the early Buddhist texts, but it's also there in the Dalai Lama's teachings. The individual's overall state of heart and mind, or motivation, is, generally speaking, the key to determining its ethical content. It's also there in Western philosophical thought. Martin Luther King's Nobel Prize speech suggests that violence is immoral because it thrives on hatred rather than love. But we can see that this kind of a vision as opposed to others. So the Buddhist idea that we should train away anger may be opposed to an Aristotelian vision that anger is appropriate at the right things, toward the right people, in the right way, at the right times, and so on. It may also be opposed to some modern liberal visions of the role of righteous anger. And even some Buddhist practices, this is Shin Viratu in Burma, who has rightly or wrongly been characterized as inciting violence against the Muslims out of a kind of anger. And I've actually seen for myself that kind of anger in Burma. So there's a certain kind of vision where we can say, well, we ought to be motivated by anger towards things that are wrong in the world. And this is a competing vision with Buddhist ethics. So again, there are these different visions of how we ought to be, and I want to suggest two Buddhist proposals for how we can evaluate them. One is that if we focus on the qualities of heart, the motivations behind our actions, and the second one is to see how we can remove distortions of perceptual distortions, which lead to distortions of thought and distortions of view. So the analogy that's given in the text is of a leper who's, in addition to the disease infecting the flesh, it also infects one's nervous system and causes people to enjoy cauterizing their flesh over hot coals. The Buddha says that in the same way, beings who are not free from lust for sensual pleasures, who are devoured by craving for sensual pleasures, who burn with fever for sensual pleasures, have faculties that are impaired. Thus, although sensual pleasures are actually painful to touch, they acquire a mistaken perception of them as pleasant. I want to read this as saying that the motivation of grasping after sensual pleasures is itself painful. If we're really inhabiting our own world of experience, really increasing alertness and decreasing affective biases of attention and memory in the way that the practice of mindfulness cultivates, that we can see for ourselves the pain of a motivation like grasping, that we can see for ourselves the pain of a motivation like anger. If we do that, I want to suggest there may be a kind of convergence in the ethical judgments we make. So I'm going to go through this bit slowly. I'm suggesting an empirical hypothesis that to the degree we're wide awake in the sense of increasing alertness and decreasing affective biases in the way that one does by practicing mindfulness, our ethical judgments of which qualities of heart are good ones will converge. And then I want to say we have this epistemic premise, which is an idea about what counts as knowledge. That is, that we each should defer to the judgments we ourselves would make if we were alert and unbiased in this way. So if it's true that we should each defer to the judgments, ethical judgments we ourselves would make if we were alert and unbiased, and it's also true that there would, and to the degree we ourselves are alert and unbiased, our judgments would converge on favoring certain qualities of heart rather than others, then we get from that an ethical conclusion. The idea is that we each have reason to defer to the shared judgments we would make if we were alert and unbiased. If this is right, what makes it the case that we ought to be motivated by friendliness, for instance, rather than hatred, is that we'd want to be motivated by friendliness rather than the other alternatives to the degree we're really feeling what those motivations are like for ourselves. Conversely, what makes it the case that we ought to be motivated by ill will is that we ourselves would not want to be motivated that way if we were alert and unbiased in this way. So one way to challenge this sort of Buddhist-derived vision of ethics is to say that it's a bit plastic-coded, that in fact there's this diversity, and we really shouldn't expect that there would be the kind of empirical convergence. Rather, there's just a mess of different judgments that people will make. That might be true, but I do think that when we talk about the ways in which a generalized level of alertness of attention can be increased, and affective biases of attention and memory that cause us to focus on a certain train of ruminative thought and not feel our bodies fully. The way we can attenuate those, I think, will be very similar for all human beings, given our cognitive architectures. And secondly, because of the shared neurobiological profiles of different emotional motivations, the way those feel to somebody who is alert and unbiased in these ways would be very similar, just given the way our bodies and our psychologies are, the way a human psychobiology is set up. So to the extent that for both sides in some ethical debate about how we ought to be, what kind of jihad should we be fighting? To the extent that both sides in such an ethical debate would have judgments that would converge if they were alert and unbiased, to that extent we each have reason to defer to that judgment, whatever it is that we would make. So you can think about it in this sense. Is it true or false that hot coals are painful to touch? Well, it's true. It's true for us. It might not be true for other kinds of beings, but it doesn't matter because that's not who we get into ethical debates with. We only get into debates about how we ought to be with human beings. So moral judgments are said to be, empirical results show that moral judgments are generalized to people in another city, in another country, or someplace far away. But they don't need to be generalized to beings that are very much unlike us. It's good enough if they are generalizable just to other human beings. So the question of whether these ethical judgments, what context are these true for? I want to say that ethical judgments are true for the human context, that for all of us, saying suffering is painful, and if we're motivated in the right ways, we respond to that kind of suffering. And given that background psychology, because these ethical questions arise in the context of human beings, in that context we can assume a certain point of view, a human one. And we can assume the certain background psychology that makes certain qualities of heart relatively more easy to bear than others. I'll skip that part in the interest of time, and that's what I've said. This is the postscript. Okay, enlightenment as an ethical ideal. I've suggested that one area of commonality between the modern Vipassana movement and the early Buddhist texts is this idea of resting in a world of experience, increasing alertness and decreasing affective biases of attention and memory such that we can see more clearly for ourselves what it's like to be motivated in different ways, the way experience arises and also the way it ceases. And I've suggested that certain ways of being, for instance, perhaps being motivated by grasping or being motivated by anger, are going to be painful for any human being, just in virtue of the way that we're constructed. I think that that gives a certain kind of directionality to a path of practice, a path from anguish to awareness, and makes a certain kind of way of being more plausible as a vision of how we ought to be than others. It's not clear that that will take us all the way to a very particular apex, to a very particular vision of what the final goal of practice is. Bob Scharf says that there's no public consensus as to the application of terms that supposedly refer to discrete experiential states within the Vipassana movement. I guess that's a mouthful. What he means is that there are these claims about enlightenment states, and there's just no public consensus. Even within a particular teaching tradition, there's people disagree about whether certain individuals or others have gained that state. And certainly between teaching traditions, there's a lot of controversy whether one or the other has correctly leads students to enlightenment. And not surprisingly, the same is found to be true in Japan, Bob says, where Rinzai and Soto monks tend to reject altogether the veracity of claims by this other lineages to have experienced Satori. So what David Vago and I said in a recent opinion piece, I think, is on the right track. Given the differences between various competing conceptions of awakening, one scientific approach to tracing enlightenment would be to use the tools of social psychology to investigate which states and traits are valued in a particular community. So we can see, by looking at people's emotions, which sorts of states they react to in others with awe, and which they react to, for instance, with disgust as not good. But we can also see how they react to their own states. And one sort of speculative hypothesis is that perhaps among individuals with high alertness and low bias, in the way that I talked about being cultivated, there would be a consensus about which sorts of states are ones that are the most valuable to work for. If we were able to characterize various sets of states with a certain neurobiological profile, we might find that if we measure people on this generalized alertness and decreases in affective biases, that there are certain ones that they converge on saying are really valuable to cultivate. In the same way that I've suggested that there might be certain emotional motivations that all human beings would converge on saying are valuable ones to be cultivated to the degree they're alert and not biased. There might be certain discrete states that people in these conditions of alertness and non-bias would all agree that are the most valuable to work for. Perhaps, perhaps not. Thank you.
Ready for some questions, Dave?
Absolutely. What did I say?
That last remark you made about the focus on being what could easily be agreed upon, I'm sort of more interested in the flip side of what are the things that are bitterly divisive? Because I have trouble thinking of what those might be.
So I'm assuming you mean like within Buddhist traditions, because things that are bitterly divisive, here's one. In certain cultures, if a young woman is raped, you ought to stone her in order to save the family's honor. From my perspective, that looks monstrous. There's a divisive thing. Within Buddhist traditions, maybe the differences aren't quite that big. But first off, I want to emphasize that I think we should think of these as presenting whole ethical visions of how human beings ought to be. And we need to know why those are good visions. And we need to compare them then with competing ones. And here's a competing one that I've just outlined. What I want to say in a case like that, where there's a real debate over fundamental values, is that to the degree we all, from any human culture, have reason to defer the judgments that we ourselves would make if we were alert and not biased. That's a sort of general epistemic norm. We could challenge that. But suppose I'm right about that, that anybody from any culture has reason to defer to the judgments that they ought to make if they were alert and not biased. Then we can go ahead and see which ethical judgments people would make if they were alert and not biased. In some cases, I think that that's going to come out on the side of we're going to have a really feel-good feeling about how that comes out. In others, I think that's not true. So for instance, I offered the case of righteous anger. So there's a lot of cases where moderate liberals are going to feel like we ought to get angry about injustice. And maybe they're right. But here's the test, if my theory works. We have to see what judgment would be made by somebody, by any of us, to the degree we were alert and not biased. And my sense is, from a Buddhist, there it goes, from a Buddhist perspective, is that, let's just do that. It's not shattered, so. My sense is, from a Buddhist perspective, the prediction is, to the degree that somebody is alert and not biased and really feeling what it's like to be motivated by righteous anger, the idea is we reject that. It's too painful. We couldn't bear to be that in that way. We couldn't bear to endorse it as a way for others to be. So my thought is that this should be a way to challenge our own ethical visions as much as anybody else's. It ought to be a way to challenge, say, traditional Burmese Buddhist visions of how we ought to be, but it also ought to be a way to challenge our own visions of how it ought to be. It's not just meant to sort of confirm our own current prejudices.
Are the prejudices determined by your culture primarily? Is that what you're saying?
We all are socialized into different values. And sorry?
So if it's based in your environment, your culture, how do you get to that point of making biased?
Yeah. So one thing that, and this is sort of speculative, one thing I've thought about is that one way in which different values can be socialized is by directing attention in different ways. So for instance, from an Aristotelian or modern liberal perspective, if anger is good, in a culture that values anger in that way, one way to do it is to direct people's attention to the positive aspects of anger and away from the negative ones. But my thought is that if you decrease these biases of attention such that you're taking in everything more generally, you have a kind of wide awakeness, that in the sense of increasing a generalized alertness, so you're taking in more stimuli internally, externally, and also decreasing the kind of affective biases of attention and memory that shut down our awareness narrowly. I didn't get to talk, because of reasons of space, too much about my ideas about that, but that's my general idea. That to the degree you do this, that certain socialized values will no longer be endorsed, precisely because you're picking up on different information. Now, one way to challenge the sort of proposal that I've put forward is to say there's no way to specify what bias is except from within some ethical framework or another. And I think that that's a really interesting challenge. I'm not sure that it succeeds, but I think that if you want the most powerful way to challenge the view that I've just sketched, that's it. Say that there's no way to specify what bias is except for some ethical. Here's my brief response to that. I want to say that there are, and this is why I did the epistemic versus the ethical thing. I think there are epistemic norms that as soon as we're in conversation with a human being, we can't get out of those epistemic norms. So, for instance, if you show me that I'm wrong about something, and I just go on asserting it, we can't continue the conversation, right? So there's certain kinds of epistemic norms that we have to have in place in order to basically coherence, a certain kind of systematicity in our thought, a certain kind of coherence between different aspects of our thought. And I want to say that in order to maintain that kind of generalized perceptual coping with the world and a kind of coherence in our thought, we need to have a certain amount of alertness and lack of biases in our attention. And if that's true, then for all of us, this is a kind of epistemic norm that we have to take on board. And if that's true, it has certain consequences. I'm not necessarily making predictions about what those consequences will be for ethics. The idea instead is we all have this epistemic norm of that we ought to defer to the judgments we ourselves would make if we were alert and not biased. Let's see how that comes out, what ethical judgments we'd make if we were alert and not biased. Maybe there's no convergence. Maybe we have some way to measure alertness and non-bias, but there's just no convergence in the ethical judgments people make. I'm just doubtful about that, but maybe that if that's so, then there's no way to adjudicate cross-cultural debates. But I think that to the degree people are alert, not biased, and really feeling what it's like to be motivated by different emotions, there will be some convergence. Trying to get in a lot. Yeah.
Can we be unbiased if we call ourselves Buddhists? Firstly. Secondly, when you referred to the purity of experience and that this was kind of brought by colonial power to Southeast Asia, doesn't the stuff like that came out of Hawaiian Po and stuff like that about there is no tree, there is no river, I think to denotes a certain purity of experience that's absolute, that predates, I don't know the dates so well, the colonial experience in Southeast Asia. And then lastly, I think it might be interesting to look at the five element theory, especially in reference to Southeast Asia.
The what
As
theory?
five elements, the five moving forces, the fatwa, and as used in acupuncture, feng shui, the art of war, all those kinds of things, as having a perhaps a more solid experiential scientific base and medical base indeed than the cardinal element stuff, which I think became more from Greece and to a certain extent
Thanks. So I don't think I'm qualified to comment on the last one. I think it's interesting. The second one, I'm on board with you. I mean, so part of what I was doing was representing a certain challenge, right? The idea that, look, it looks like all this stuff came from the West. It's a bit like the Fisher-Price Zen collection, Cradle Swing. But that was, I was representing that challenge from folks like Bob and David and Eric, Bob Scharf, David McMahon, Eric Braun, not because I think it's all right, but rather because I wanted to respond to it. And one way I tried to respond was to say something like you did, but for the case of the Vipassana, where I said, well, look, it looks to me like there are a lot of what they're saying is very modern, is found in the early Buddhist texts. So I was saying something very much like you were saying in that case.
Buddhist and unbiased.
Ah, thank you. How can we be unbiased if we call ourselves Buddhists? Well, it seems to me that we could certainly be biased and call ourselves Buddhist, and we could be biased and call ourselves secular, and we could be biased and call ourselves scientistic materialists. But we can also be unbiased and probably call ourselves most of those things too. For me, it doesn't matter so much what we're calling ourselves, but rather the degree to which, the way in which our attention is structuring our experience. I do think that the ways in which so to the degree somebody's alert and not biased, that may have impacts for which ethical visions they want to identify with, absolutely. But that's in virtue of the fact that we might not want to endorse being motivated certain ways, right? So we might not want to endorse certain kinds of power structures just in virtue of being motivated by compassion, right? So we might not want to endorse certain kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Misogynistic structures within Buddhism, precisely because we're motivated by compassion. Why should we be motivated by compassion? Because that's the motivation we ourselves would endorse if we were alert and not biased on this view. But I don't have a direct answer to the question. I mean, it depends on which Buddhism, which ethical vision. Which ethical visions can we endorse while being not biased? Well, then I do start to have some predictions. Here's some. I think we're going to endorse visions that would be motivated, visions of being motivated by compassion and the actions that fall from that. Not visions of being motivated by anger and the actions that fall from that. Does that help? Okay.
Jake, thank you for your presentation.
Yeah.
I have a concern.
Good. Me too.
I think one of the questions you're interested in is how to be, but I'm not sure if I see Buddhism as presenting an ethical system. In fact, I see it as rather saying that question itself, that being itself, is part of the problem, this desire to exist. So asking how to be privileges is that, and privileges, reality on the level of beings, and aside from maybe simply limiting what Buddhism has to say, saying that it only has to say things about ethics or even meta-ethics, I fear that reifies beings and also subtly subscribes to a metaphysical system that includes the existence of a self, existence of only humans as compared to maybe like beings in other realms, or and subscribes to metaphysics that includes only life. There's only this life. There's nothing after death. So I fear that viewing it from an ethical viewpoint kind of subtly smuggles in this cosmology that can be left unexamined. And I think that
That's a lot.
Yeah, so that might foreclose upon part of the Dhamma that could actually be really useful to explore some of the things that you yourself said. Maybe you don't know how to negotiate like the epistemic norms. Maybe viewing it from this broader viewpoint could have some comment on how to, work past that and pass like saying that, okay, we just have to accept that there's epistemic norms.
That is great. So it's a very rich question.
Could you sort of rephrase that a little bit?
Okay. There's maybe 3 issues involved here. One is a really deep question about the nature of what Buddhist texts are doing and Buddhist traditions are doing. And here I've brought in a sort of Western theoretical philosophical framework to ask a kind of question that gets asked in a Western thought world. And this question of how to be. And you then went 2 directions with it. So one worry about that is just like, well, maybe that's not the kind of question the Buddhist texts are asking. Maria has pushed me on this. That's why I'm smiling at her, very helpfully. So I think that that's a really good question. My response there is with a question. So one thing to do from a traditional perspective with a question is to answer it. A different thing to do with a question from this traditional perspective is to respond with a question. And so a different thing to do is to set it aside. But if you want to set that question aside, then here's my next question. Why should that kind of question be set aside, right? So here's the question. If you say that's not the right kind of question to ask, the Buddhist tradition has some better thing to offer. What I want to ask then is, great, why is that question not the right one to ask? What about that question makes it the wrong one to ask?
That's great. I don't think it's the wrong question to ask. In fact, I think it's a very skillful question to ask, and maybe it's skillful to kind of bring people in through a question that's meaningful to them. Mm-hmm. Just in the same way, like, in the story of the Buddha after he becomes enlightened, the first person he comes across in his path, the person asks him, like, oh, who are you? Why should I listen to you? And the Buddha's like, oh, I'm unexcelled, I'm like unborn, I'm awesome. And the guy's like, okay, maybe so, but he just walks on. And then his first teaching to the 5 people in the deer park is like, oh, like, let me tell you about life, let me tell you about like suffering, let me tell you about like pain. And they're like, oh yeah, this is good stuff. So I think it's a very skillful question. I just would encourage, I don't know, I want to like go even further because it's so good.
Okay.
So
So the first area was about whether that form of the question is the kind of question that these texts and traditions ask, and maybe there's a better question that we can get, that they can suggest for us to ask. In general, I want to say that focusing on the notion of ethics in a Western sense is really not actually what I'm up to. I think that the Buddhist texts are. There's no plausible way to argue that they aren't trying to show us ways to be, that they aren't encouraging us to do certain things and not others. They're doing that. They're definitely doing that. And then I think it's legitimate on our part to ask why. Why should we do that and not that? And if they want to set that question, if the approach from there wants to set that question aside, I want to ask why. Why do you want to set that question aside?
Yeah, I don't think I'm trying to say.
I'm reiterating since I'm the speaker, I get to read. I'm teasing. I'm just teasing about that. Okay, so that was the first move, and I think it's a really great question. Then in that same great question, you had a whole other direction, which was about being, right? So why ask it in the form of how should we be? Because that seems to privilege a certain kind of being and existence, and maybe even a whole notion of self and so on. I don't think I was actually doing that. I mean, if that's right, just phrase it in some other way. Why train your attention this way and not that way? You know? Why pay attention to why train your attention so as to reduce greed, hatred, and aversion instead of so as to increase greed? There's plenty of ways to train your attention. I do it all the time. Train my attention to increase greed, hatred. Why not do that? So if you don't like the being, I I was just not saying act. Because I think that focus on acts is very much a feature of the Western philosophical tradition that the Buddhists can do better than. But if you want to say train your attention, why train your attention this way and not that? And then there was this vision, the final part of the question had to do really with cosmology. And I think you're right. Look, there's a lot to be gained that beyond the kind of scientific materialism that we tend to assume in our context. That's absolutely right. But here's the problem. If I assume a particular Buddhist metaphysics, there's always the problem of some other Buddhist metaphysics. And if I assume what's common to Buddhist metaphysics, there's always the problem of some other some other non-Buddhist metaphysics, right? Including scientific materialism, but also theistic metaphysics. So if we want to, and what I'm really interested in addressing is questions like, well, should we stone people for being raped? And do the Buddhists have anything to say about that? I mean, they can say no, but beyond that, why should we say no to that question? If in trying to answer that question, where you have debates, disputes over fundamental ethical values between human cultures that don't share their metaphysical visions, appealing to a particular metaphysical vision does nothing to adjudicate that debate, and that's why I don't do it. Doesn't mean it doesn't have something to offer in a different context, but that's why I don't do it in this one. Thank you. Great questions.
We have time for maybe one, maybe two questions. More, if anybody has any. Going once?
No, somebody asked something.
Don't let him go. Don't let him go.
We didn't hear a lot about the neurocorrelates.
I just want to throw out,
Please.
I think that one of the things that our earlier speakers in this series, and that's why we brought you to the end, because we knew that you sort of go up against our first couple of speakers. It's a noble tradition. I think they're not saying so much that there's no such thing as meditation in the Burma
They're not,
tradition.
and neither is Bob.
They're talking more about mass lay meditation movements, and that's what's new in Burma, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there are in the texts lay people meditating. But I don't think that can just be what they're saying that's new.
That was just somebody else asked a question.
I mean, it's all a matter of degree. And when I talk to, for instance, talking to Dave McMahon, what he says is, I was emphasizing the newness of this because everybody else is emphasizing, maybe within these traditions, emphasizing the continuity of these practice. Of these kind of emphasis on experience and so on, all the way back to the Buddha. And I was showing how there is a discontinuity there. That doesn't mean there isn't a commonality. So in a certain way, all I'm doing is having proposing a different emphasis. But nonetheless, I think it's an important one, in part because the historical considerations can seem like an undercutter to the ethical vision. If our idea was that this is how we should be practicing because that's how the Buddha practiced, and all of a sudden the history looks like that's not how the Buddha practiced, or at least it doesn't go back there, that can make us think, or if it looks like the Fisher-Price Zen Collection chair, well then why should we be like that, really? I think it serves that kind of historical thing. Here's a different, here's something that philosophers like to play with. If we give you an evolutionary account, say, of why all human beings value compassion. I mean, they don't, but suppose there's this common human value on compassion. It just turns out that that's because that's what it took for mothers and babies to get along such that we remained here. The genetic lineage continued to get us here. Then it looks like an undercutter. It makes it look like, well, we don't really know that that's the right way to be. That's just the way that we're programmed to value. And I think that a similar thing happens when you give a historical explanation of, say, the Vipassana movement, that it looks like, well, it's not because that was the right way to be, it's just because the particular historical conditions came together, and maybe we shouldn't be valuing that way to be. So I want to push back against really both of those, right? And say, well, independent of the historical derivation of the Vipassana values or the historical derivation of human values on compassion, there's things we can say in light of the fact that we only get into debates with human beings about how we ought to be, and secondly, that we share a certain common architecture, such that any human being, to the degree they were really alert and unbiased, or in whatever kind of epistemic state is ideal, they were really knowledgeable, there's certain things they would converge on. And just because we only get into debates with other people, to the degree there is some things we would converge on in these ideal states, then those are what makes it right or wrong for us to say value compassion or value vipassana.
You know, I read a translation of the Upanishads years ago, but what I took from that, and that's Hinduism, I believe, but that's the only thing I know about Hinduism, but was that there wasn't the emphasis on meditation as much as on service, which I really related to because I struggle against meditation heartily. So I found that really refreshing to hear tonight.
So I always kind of, not always, but recently anyway, kind of smirk to myself when I ask whether people think of themselves as meditators. And the reason for that is that you can't help but be training your attention in some ways. The question is whether you're...
Mindfulness itself does that, don't you think?
The question is whether... Well, so watching TV trains your attention in certain ways, right? All sorts of bad things train your attention in various ways. The question, are they training your attention in the ways you want to be training? And secondly, are they training your attention in the ways you should want to be training? That's the real question. We're always cultivating certain habits of heart and mind. The question is, are we cultivating good ones? So for me, the question of bhavana, of cultivation, bhavana gets translated as meditation. This question is not one of, are you meditating? You're always cultivating something. You're always doing bhavana. The question is, which are you doing a good one?
But isn't that going to require some outside criteria beyond the experiential content itself to decide whether it's good or bad?
So, I've sort of given you my proposal, but I think that it requires there to be something that we would converge on under ideal epistemic conditions. If you agree with me that there's this kind of epistemic norm among human beings that we ought, in all things considered, to be alert and not biased, we ought to defer to the judgments that we ourselves would make if we were alert and not biased. That's an epistemic norm. And you think with me that to the degree we do that, we are alert and not biased, there will be some kind of convergence in the judgments we make. That provides all the criteria we're ever going to get for any value judgment, I think. There's just nothing else to refer to. There's no other criterion against which to measure these things. We can do it from within a particular cultural context, in which case we do have certain norms in place. But if we want something that's going to settle the kind of questions that I'm interested in, adjudicate fundamental debates over fundamental values between cultures, I think it's the best way to go. But I think there's lots of problems with my approach. It's just I don't see anything better.
That's not the approach of the Buddha himself.
Oh, you were there?
Yeah, I was. Actually, I read it in the Buddhist.
Yeah.
Right? And I think what he said was something more like, does it decrease suffering and increase happiness? Right?
Yeah, so there's lots of ways to take that. And the question that I find interesting is who's suffering? And then, well, so if you do it, there's two ways to go, right? Aggregate suffering in the world, in which case you end up with a kind of a consequentialist version of ethics, where we ought to act in the ways that would maximize happiness or minimize suffering in the world. Or you can go with your own suffering, what would minimize your own suffering, in which case I think you're running an ethics very much like mine, but a little bit different. So the way my ethics runs is that we ought to cultivate the emotional motivations that we ourselves would endorse if we were alert and not biased. Now it turns out that to the degree we're alert and not biased, we just can't endorse certain motivations. Why? Because they're so painful. We can't.
But doesn't that sort of presuppose that you're already alert and unbiased? I mean, the advantage of simply inspecting whether you're suffering less and are more happy means you can do it from any part of your life, whatever your emotional development at the time, right? So you don't need to be already alert and unbiased before you can know whether this is a good decision to make.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to push back. one thing to say is just that I was sort of assuming that we're doing our best to be alert and unbiased. The idea is what criterion against which can we judge that we've gotten it wrong certain times, right? So sometimes I might make a judgment that's actually the wrong judgment. I might think that I should have been motivated this way, and in fact I should have been motivated that way. Because and this is also in the text, this idea that we can have distortions of perception and distortions of thought and distortions of view. And we can have those distortions precisely because of biases and lack of alertness, because our awareness is not full, not unbiased. So we can make the wrong judgments about what is actually, I mean, this was in the quote that I put up. We can make the wrong judgment about what counts as suffering, right? So I think you're right that we do go on that basis, and we should go on that basis from the early Buddhist perspective, but that because we can also get it wrong, what we're really doing is saying, look, I'm pretty alert and pretty not biased in this moment, and so I'm making this judgment now because it's the best approximation I've got. But here's a different way. This actually speaks to the question that you were raising before the talk. There's a different way, which is to look to wise people and the judgments they make. And I think that's a huge part of the tradition, and a huge important part of the tradition, precisely because we can get it wrong often. I do, right? So that's why I think it's really important, not just this line that I quoted, that the Dhamma is to be experienced by the wise for themselves, pachadam veditapo in yuhi, but also that in characterizing what's skillful, one of the ways to characterize it is as what's skillful is what's praised by the wise. And what's unskillful is what's criticized by the wise. Not just criticized by anybody, because people criticize all sorts of things, right? So if you think that we should be motivated by anger, or you think that we should stone people for being raped, or whatever, then you're going to criticize certain ways of being that you shouldn't criticize. You should praise them. Or I shouldn't criticize, I should praise them, because we can get it wrong. Even though we have some awareness, but we can get it wrong. So we have to look to the wise. So that's the general idea.
I think we're going to have to stop here. We've worked him hard.
Oh, I'm
he'll
still
be here for
going.
a few minutes as we get organized. So let's give Jake another big hand. Thank you. As I said, next spring we have another series coming up. There's an app for that, so if you want to learn to meditate like a Zen master at the push of a button, come on back in the spring, all right? Thanks.